Hello, in this video clip I have tried to show how we can roll an application into Kubernetes. So for this example I have a Spring Boot application which is accessing AWS S3 and also some database. It could be a Mongo database or an Oracle or an RDS database. And just for an example I'm using this setup, and for having a Spring Boot application to run, what we would do in our regular setup is I would take this Spring Boot, compile it into a jar, and then deploy that into a web application, somewhere into a Tomcat or a Wildfly. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take this application and I'm going to put it as part of the Tomcat. So I will package the Spring Boot application into a Tomcat server. So once I have this, then I can take this bundle and I can take it to this jar file, which could be a fat jar, and I can run this jar file on any machine. So I can go on a virtual machine and I can run this, or I can take this on my laptop and I can run this application, which will have a Tomcat embedded in it. So that's good. And what do we do next with this? So what we will do is we'll take the same thing, same jar file, and it says let's package this jar file to run in a Docker container. So Docker container, as you may know, is a stripped down version of a virtual machine, just at a definition level. So we are saying, okay, rather than giving me just this one jar file which has the Spring Boot plus Tomcat, give me another file which will also have the operating system elements built in it, so that I will have that as a virtual machine file. So for that I will package this Spring Boot Tomcat into a Docker container, and that is defined in a Docker file. So I will use a Docker file, define what operating system I need to run, and then I would say I would like to run this packaged jar file which has a Spring Boot and Tomcat in it. Once I have this container, I can take this container image with image file, and I can spin it up in any Docker environment. So that's good for the Docker, right? So now I can have my Docker container running, which will be able to serve me whatever this Spring Boot application does. But that's not what we want. We want little more than that. And for that we want to package this into a pod, and pod is a Kubernetes concept. So we cannot have a individual Docker container running in Kubernetes. We have to package that container into a pod using a deployment definition file. So the deployment definition file, whether it's a JSON or a YAML, it tells us how we are going to package this or build this pod, which will have this container in it. So once we have this pod defined, then we are ready to put this pod in Kubernetes. So once the deployment definition is defined, we can run this deployment in Kubernetes, and your pod will come alive in Kubernetes. And with that pod being alive in Kubernetes, you will have your container, and which will invoke your Tomcat and Spring Boot setup. So you will have your application running in Kubernetes and ready to be serving, where the application will go out to S3 and the databases, assuming all those connectivities are all set. So now in Kubernetes there is also another concept of service. So this service is a key for Kubernetes because it gives us the ability of having the application highly available, and because of that the service is used in front of the pods. Once the pod is up and the service can also be deployed, And once we have the service deployed, a user will make a request to the service, and the service will take the request to the pod and into the container, get that service results, and returns it back to the users. So this process of using a service in front of our pod gives us the ability to have multiple pods running in the back, or horizontally scale those pods based on the workload, and all of that can be controlled by different deployment options that we have in Kubernetes. And I hope this gives an idea of how a simple Spring Boot application can be bundled and layered into something which can be used in Kubernetes. We will talk more about the Docker file and deployment definition files sometime later.